Hello and welcome to Food Safety and Public Health Webinar, May 2019. We will be starting today's webinar with a short video, and sound will come through your computer speakers. And now I would like to introduce your presenter for today, Ruth T Tran, Vice President of Food Safety and Public Health. Ruth, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Connie, and welcome everyone to this installment of our Food Safety and Public Health Matters webinar. As we wait for the slides to come up, I do want to give a quick introduction. My name is Ruth T Tran, as was stated, and I have the privilege of leading the food safety and public health technical efforts here at Ecolab. Part of my job involves our topic today, and that is keeping up to date on what's going on in the world that can impact food safety. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart, and I look forward to interacting with you on it. Because the reality is there's a lot going on in our industry, and if you just think about your lives perhaps in the last week or so, I'm guessing that you probably ate something or saw something on a restaurant menu that you'd never eaten before. I know I did. I was at the National Restaurant Association show this week and certainly ate a lot of non-meat, meat substitute sorts of products. It's becoming the reality that it's an every week occurrence that we're exposed to these kinds of varieties. But I think it's important as we think about these innovations and enjoy them that we look around and think hard about the possible food safety risks that they can present. We need to take a balanced look so we can serve up these new and safe offerings in order to grow our business. And as stated, I'm proud to be here representing Ecolab, where safe food is a very important and key part of our vision in our quest to make the world cleaner, safer, and healthier. So in this webinar today, we'll talk through what consumers are saying and demanding, some of these that play into the current trends that we face today, how we need to think about managing these food safety risks, and through that we'll take a look at some of the recent health inspection trends, talk about briefly some programs, and then as stated, allow ample time for questions at the end. And as you will remember, there is a Q&A panel on the side of your screen into which you type your question, and then we can get to those after the webinar formal presentation finishes. So please do send in questions there. So of course, the whole idea of safe food is fundamental to all of us. We expect it. It's integral in our brand protection and enterprise risk management. And the reality is there's a lot of stress on our food supply today that can lead to unsafe foods unless we have very robust food safety management programs. And it's these programs and their implementation that help to reduce the risks. And I certainly like the word trends, and it's what we say, but I think in large part, they're becoming more realities and that they are just what it is, because there's lots of these coming at us all the time that can spur excitement from consumers and drive our businesses forward. But they do become mainstream and turn into these realities that are what they are. But we do need to continually manage these with a risk-based approach, even when they become realities, and make sure that we keep the technical challenges in mind as well. I like these data to start myself off when I think about these new realities, because we know that consumers really don't think about food safety when they go into a restaurant. They expect that the food they're consuming and will order is safe, but look what's driving their selection of restaurants. It's quality of the food, and if we think about what we ourselves would do, it's very intuitive that we're going to go where the food quality is good. And then certainly we're looking for value, and then you could see the other characteristics laid out here in areas of ambiance, et cetera. It's really our job to make sure that consumers continue to be able to achieve these priorities, but ensure safety as well. And we know that consumer demands are increasing. They want to see clean labels. They're more interested in what we may have previously described as trendy foods, such as local, organic, and these plant-based proteins. But again, these are much more mainstream today than ever before. We know that most consumers prefer no artificial ingredients in food, yet balanced against the reality that they may not necessarily want to pay for them. We know that taste and price will certainly drive buying decisions, but the whole presence of these influencers through social media will continue to push for some of these new ideas. And then we need to be thinking about transparency in production and the so-called life cycle of the product, of what happened to that food before it landed on my plate in a restaurant. I like the word customized eating, and this relates to the idea that we can seek out and find many options to satisfy our increasingly demanding palates. It's very easy for all of us, I think, to think about where we could go get natural foods or organic, where we can get a locally sourced menu, one without preservatives. We know where we can go to get vegan meals or low-carb meals. Just think about what a huge variety of foods are available to us all. Generally, we tend to look for what we know more than we look to avoid what we don't know. It's human nature, I think, to seek out the familiar, and this feeds into the idea of having transparency into our food supply. So people are reading labels and looking for some of these symbols, which are becoming more and more pervasive, and what happened to that food before it hit that restaurant. But through it all, we need to keep safety in the back of our minds for guests. And just because the food is organic or local doesn't mean it's safe, but it also doesn't mean it's unsafe. We need to assess that. And we need to keep in mind that removing ingredients like sodium or salt, which are put there for very important reasons, like preventing growth of microorganisms, can actually have a negative effect. Think about preserving food, which has been done for hundreds and thousands of years using salt, which retards the growth of microorganisms. It's okay to take salt out, but we need to account for the fact that there may be growth that's less controlled, so we need to come up with alternate ways to control it. what we're seeing is that consumers are pretty willing to try lots and lots of different kinds of foods. And if we just think about the variety of foods that we have in our retail settings today, with grocery stores having an estimated 40,000 more SKUs available than just 20 years ago. We know that these non-traditional protein sources are rising in popularity. And in fact, the dollar sales of some of these plant-based alternatives grew 17% in the past year. This is against the backdrop of the total U.S. retail food dollar sales growing just 2%. Here's a reality. In order to meet these demands, we need to source increasingly from the developing world. And these are data demonstrating what has been exported from so-called low and middle income countries, rising in popularity over these, especially last 10 years, to meet these demands. So the reality is there's lots of so-called food miles on what we want to eat. For example, it's estimated that 91% of our U.S. seafood is imported from some of these lower or middle income countries. And we see these imports coming in from places like Canada, but also China and Chile and Indonesia. So we need to consider also how much choice we have in ethnic dining options locally. Again, wide variety, which is wonderful and allows for that consumer to meet their demands related to food quality and food variety, but where's it all coming from? Here's a graphic I like as well, which is a somewhat typical sort of fast food hamburger that we might all choose to eat. And the reality is that in order to meet the demand for this kind of a food, sourcing needs to be done very broadly from literally the corners of the globe to meet these demands for things like spices, flavors, and other ingredients. But we need to think about where these key and highly desired ingredients are coming from and how advanced are the food safety systems in these faraway countries. Will they adequately control the most relevant risks? Do you know how those ingredients are handled? Consider that a lot of our spices come from countries like India and in Southeast Asia, where the growing conditions are ideal, but the food safety systems may not be as strong as we're used to. Now, risks can certainly be managed, but we need to be aware of them so we know how to manage them. And it's data like these which can help inform where we need to put efforts. Several years ago, the World Health Organization embarked on a project to plot out where global foodborne illness was occurring. And they came up with charts like this, which is very much a summary of this work. But we see high bars in areas such as Africa and Southeast Asia. And although in the developed world, which are generally the lower bars on the graph here, we saw that issues with norovirus, Campylobacter, E. coli, and Salmonella were pretty consistently seen. But these developing world countries, in addition to having microbial concerns, also had some hazards from chemicals, things like dioxins and aflatoxin, which may be pretty well controlled in other parts of the world, but there are challenges in some of these other areas. Keeping this in mind helps define what sorts of practices need to be in place. And any users of ingredients that are sourced from these areas need to be especially mindful and very aware of what's going on. We also know that consumers want easy. According to the International Food and Information Council's 2017 Food and Health Survey, It's estimated that 55% of millennials say convenience is a top driver when buying food. Curiously, while baby boomers say that taste matters more. And if we think about it, it's millennials are really the drivers behind meal kits, grocery delivery services, food trucks, online ordering, and the growth of heat and eat options at grocery stores. Now, certainly in the area of delivery, we're seeing growth around the world growing. And anybody who's traveled, especially to Asia, can see this. We see increases going on, especially in areas like the Middle East and South Korea. And in fact, another study I read estimated that by 2020, restaurants who don't offer online ordering and delivery may lose up to 70% of their customers. So it's increasingly becoming an expectation that we can all have access to. But with this expectation, certainly some new things to think about. So what risks may be introduced in delivery? How is temperature controlled? How about the potential for cross-contamination? These are very key and important contributing factors to foodborne illness, which require control. Are they controlled in these delivery environments? The other piece is that there are many groups illustrated by some of these icons here on the slide who are working to define standards for what should be in place, and that's a very important exercise. We're seeing some movement towards formalization of these. For example, there is guidance out there today from the CDC on foodsafety.gov. There's a Conference for Food Protection Committee working on trying to define standards, and their findings will go to FDA for their consideration. And there's other groups. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we should expect some degree of regulations pretty soon. We need to consider consumer expectations of looking for delivery, but the risk is that we will potentially have a so-called patchwork of regulations with different requirements by states or by county or city versus potentially one standard across the U.S. And these are very hard to manage, especially for restaurant companies who have locations crossing state lines or even county lines. But we need to stay up on this, and staying connected into what is coming is really important. So what do we do here? Reality is there's a lot of complexity, and we need to, in my mind, figuratively walk the tightrope between satisfying what consumers want and these food safety risks that are presented by some of these demands. To do this, we need consistent food safety risk management strategies. I like simple, and to me it gets back to one of my favorite sayings, which is think like a hazard. That is, put yourself in the shoes of what the hazard might be, and then think about how it needs to be controlled. But we also need to be mindful of the potential risks that might be presented and make sure we're focused in on those risks that are most prominent. So we need to think about what can impact that hazard. Where does it come from? How is it spread around? What new research is out there? And then we need to think about how that particular risk needs to be controlled most optimally with proven preventive controls. Through that, then, we need to implement procedures and practices with food handlers, verify that they are in place, and through it all to stay current on the latest science to inform what needs to be done. And a key piece of this is to really step back and to fully understand why these risks are important and how best to manage them. We really need to move from being constantly reactive to proactive. And we've listed here a couple things that fall into this reactive category. Responding to what is coming at you on a daily basis, which may mean or may be from violations from health inspections or complaints that you may get. By implementing a strong food safety culture, you can get to consistently higher performing results on health inspections, lowering the risk of guest complaints and potential social media exposure. So one of those pieces of information is to look at what we see in health inspection trends. And this slide lays out some of the most commonly reported kinds of violation and essentially the track record over time. And I think from this, we can see why it's important to look at data like these and to react to it, because we see fairly remarkable consistency over time in what is cited, but also some upticks that are occurring, at least in the most recent set of inspection data that we have. So we do need to be aware of what's being cited, because we're seeing these repeat patterns, and then take action appropriately. For example, on the far left on this slide, we're seeing issues with food contact surfaces and their cleanliness being reported around 20% of the time, and being out of compliance 20% of the time. That's a key fact to keep in mind to make sure that we're reacting to it. So we know that managing food safety can be challenging, but if we look at these food contact surfaces not being cleaned properly, and the fact that a lot of foodborne illness frankly originates in a commercial food service setting, and that a lot of outbreaks, maybe 20%, seem to be tied to inadequate cleaning, I think there's some clues here banging us in the head as to what we need to be focusing in on. So considering a strategy focusing in on this most cited violations that really do have a pretty significant impact on food safety, such as lapses in cleaning and sanitizing, makes a lot of sense. Because as the NRA estimates, the average cost of an outbreak to a restaurant is at least $75,000. So what do we do about cleaning and sanitizing? Well, the food code is pretty clear on what needs to be done: washing, rinsing, and sanitizing, which is very effective, but it can be complex and time-consuming. And the food code actually gives some variation here in how this is accomplished. The expectation is that food contact surfaces are clean. But what's key is to focus on this outcome of having a clean and sanitary surface, but consider in the particular variability that may exist in practices and operations that are specific to each of your locations that can impact this long-term outcome. Certainly keeping in mind the food code requirements of having a clean and sanitary surface, sanitized every 4 hours at a minimum. So thinking about how you can best assure that these cleaning and sanitation procedures are followed is important. So again, simpler is better. For example, using a ready-to-use kind of product that's all mixed and all measured, doesn't need to be dispensed. It's easy to use. It's easy for your employees to understand, to only use one product, reducing the number of products that are needed, et cetera. And then certainly following the directions which are on the label. Applying the product to the surface, wiping down, reapply, letting it sit on the surface for the time specified to ensure that you have the proper food contact sanitizing time is just really, really important and can help mitigate some of those concerns that we talked about. So that's one example, and there's countless others that we can go into in discussion if you would like. But as we wrap up here, as we think about what can result from this strong food safety program, obviously it's protection of guests and employees, But we also know that there's an impact on your business as well. And these are facts from the National Restaurant Association, where putting a strong food safety program certainly allows for the avoidance of costly fees that might be directed towards legal, medical, et cetera. Avoiding downtime, because we know and have seen in previous situations that recovery from a negative incident can take many, many years in some cases. Paying attention to food safety can result in quality improvements as well, like increases in shelf life of food, which may result in a reduction in food waste. And then certainly higher food quality, which, as we saw in the earlier data, this drives consumer satisfaction and is a key driver for them to return to a restaurant. So in the midst of all of these realities of consumers' demands today, we need to keep our eye on food safety, and I do think it will bring substantial business benefit as well. And now we're coming to the question and answer portion of the webinar. I would be happy to take questions on any of these topics that we discussed, and I look forward to a dialogue. Again, I would highlight the Q&A panel on the side of your screen for you to submit questions to. And my colleague Annie is on the line and will be directing questions to me. Do we have any, Annie?
Yes, thank you, Ruth. We've had some good questions come in, and we'll address as many of them as we can. Again, please keep in mind you can submit questions via the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. The first question we'll start with is, how do I prioritize which food safety risks to focus on?
Good question. There's certainly a lot out there. And what I tend to go with is focusing in on those factors that contribute to foodborne illness the most. We have and are privileged in this country to have the Centers for Disease Control who do a lot of summarizing of this kind of information for us. And they have told us, for example, based on their review of previous foodborne illnesses, that characteristics like poor personal hygiene, improper holding of food at improper temperatures, either too cold or, not cold enough or not hot enough, inadequate cooking, so not cooking a food to the right temperature, this contamination from the equipment and environment that we spoke about, as well as unsafe sources, that upstream, where did the food come from and what happened to it, are the main contributors to foodborne illness. So focusing in on these makes good sense because it will have a big impact on the total food safety risk profile.
Thank you. The next question we have are, what are the top causes of foodborne illness that I need to be concerned about?
Well, again, I point to the US CDC, as well as that World Health Organization data that I referenced in the presentation. Around the world, we know that norovirus is the #1 foodborne illness. And just thinking about the biology, again, thinking like that hazard of norovirus, we know that it originates from people. And it's very contagious once someone has norovirus. So things like personal hygiene are really, really important when trying to control norovirus. And this is very basic things like ensuring proper hand washing, ensuring that people who are sick stay home when they're in a food handling kind of role, et cetera. The second most common foodborne illness in the U.S. and also around the world is salmonella. Again, think like that salmonella hazard. Where does it come from? Well, it's an animal-derived illness. So typically from foods that come from animal sources. So eggs, meat, poultry meat in particular, or other foods that might be contaminated by animal waste products. So we have seen salmonella associated with things like fresh produce et cetera. Then we see issues with toxin-related illnesses, things like Clostridium perfringens, which typically are related to improper holding temperatures, so not cooling a food adequately or holding it at too warm of a temperature, not effectively refrigerating a food or holding it at above 135 degrees Fahrenheit can lead to proliferation of some of these illnesses. And that's the number 3 cause of foodborne illness in the U.S. Another one we need to think about is just food allergies in general. We know that they are becoming more and more common among consumers. This is controlled by proper sourcing of foods, being aware of their ingredients and what allergenic components might be in them, and then effective cleaning to remove any contaminating food soil that might contain an allergen that could affect the next dish of food that's prepared on that surface. So being aware of those and then linking those risks to how they need to be controlled is really important.
Thank you. Another question came in. Are all of the statistics you mentioned specific to North America only, or do they apply globally, specifically to Latin America?
That's a really good question. I tend to source from North American stats, but I am constantly on the lookout for more broad sets of statistics. And I do have data where I can get it and would be happy to follow up personally with someone who wants more specific information. The challenge is that we don't have a good, consistent supply of these kinds of data from around the world. And specifically, and unfortunately, Latin America and the southern or South American regions are regions where we don't have a lot of consistently valid kinds of data. Certainly there are pockets of good data by country or by city, and I don't want to discredit those because there's lots of efforts being done to gather the data. But our surveillance programs in some of these areas just aren't as robust as they are in other areas, and that poses challenges to what we can conclude. However, given that the World Health Organization data, which I showed you, which did include some regions in Latin and South America, which were pretty consistent with what we saw in some of the other parts of the world, I'm comfortable saying, without a lot of hard data behind me, that it's likely there's some consistency in what we see, and applying the data that we see from North America, at least to part of the world, makes sense. Again, we know that norovirus is prevalent around the world, so focusing in on what we need to do to control that is really important. Whether it's officially reported by the public health authorities or not, it's one to focus in on. Salmonella as well, we know is very common around the world, so needs focus.
Thank you. Do you know of any local health departments that are inspecting food delivery services such as Grubhub or DoorDash?
Sure. And I'm familiar with some of the kind of logistics of these kinds of offerings to some extent, but in general, if there is a facility at which these organizations are assembling food, imagine like a commissary setting where food is being prepared to some extent, and, you know, portioned up, perhaps done some initial preparation, et cetera. Those are required to be licensed facilities, so they, yes, would be inspected per the particular requirements of that local health department jurisdiction, which could be under state authority, could be under city, county, et cetera. So if there's a food preparation activity going on, yes, they would be inspected and expected to meet food code type criteria. For a facility or a service that is literally just a pickup from a place and deliver it to a consumer's home, that's really outside the jurisdiction of food code type inspected operations, and it's reliant instead on a delivery system. In those cases, and this is where some of the challenges are, not as much oversight as I think is probably needed, and I think that's my point about there needs to be recognition of that and some standards put in place, which we are starting to see some activity on. The challenge is that there's a wide variety of delivery kinds of systems being used, from literally Uber drivers and sort of typical delivery systems that we would see out there. So disseminating the proper and correct food safety information to this wide variety, I think, is going to pose some challenges.
Okay, and how do I stay current on emerging information about food safety hazards?
That's a really good question, and the good news is that there's a lot of information out there. I think it's good in that there's a lot of information, but it can potentially be challenging as well, as we need to sort through and make sure we're focused in on those sources that are most accurate. I tend to go to government sources as my primary source of information, because I believe the information that's posted on, say, FDA or CDC kind of websites is well vetted by technical experts within those agencies. In addition, state health department websites are a great source of information as well. And again, that content is curated by experts within technical roles at the state health departments and so on. So going there for information is really helpful. Also, things like looking and being aware of what kinds of foods are being recalled or where foodborne illnesses are occurring. And that can be directly subscribed to from either FDA or FSIS on the USDA side for meat. And then CDC has a great pages and so on of ongoing outbreaks. And reading this information to try to understand what are the top foods that are being affected today by food safety concerns, what are some of the characteristics of these outbreaks and illnesses that are occurring that, again, can help inform us about where do I need to be focusing my efforts. Certainly there's a lot of trade publications out there that we all can subscribe to that have, again, more insightful information. Also through trade associations, they often have, those that are food related have food safety departments, and they are helping us to scan the literature, et cetera, to keep us aware of insights that are out there. And then there certainly are blog posts as well, and more in the social media realm. Certainly that needs to be considered very carefully for the accuracy of the information, and potentially double checked even a little bit harder than that might be coming from a government source. But it can be a source of good information, which I do rely on to some extent.
Great. Now we have another one on allergens. Can you talk a little bit more about how to remove allergens through cleaning? Is there a standard, and how do you close the loop to ensure that those allergens are removed?
Great. Yeah, cleaning is a really effective way to remove allergens, but it needs to be done properly. So things like choosing the right kind of cleaner related to the particular kind of food soil that might be there. And some soils, like carbohydrates or, dough kind of products, are relatively easy to remove. So a simpler kind of cleaner is probably effective there. For more complex soils that might have fat or protein included, you need a stronger cleaner because it's just got more chemical molecules in there that need to be broken up. And you certainly need stronger detergent capabilities to break up that soil. So this is where working with your cleaning and sanitation provider is really important because they can best advise on what's the best cleaner for the particular food soils of concern. Research has shown that if a surface is cleaned such that it is, quote, visibly clean, that is, there's no visible soil there, that gives good assurance of removal of that allergen. Now, that is a standard that's applied both in the manufacturing setting and in the restaurant setting as well. In addition, there are test kits that can be used, but this use of this visual clean sort of standard is pretty widely adopted.
Thank you. And we'll take one more question here. How does social media, or how have you seen in your experience social media playing into the emerging trends in terms of food safety?
Good question, because social media, I think, kind of drives our lives. Certainly we get news about our families and news about the news and news about everything through those sources, and food safety is no exception. We can find out about everything through that. But we need to, again, consider the sources and ultimate sources of the information that's being presented and can lead to misleading information about the safety of foods as well. I think restaurants can particularly use social media in a couple different ways. One is to be proactive and use social media as an opportunity and a strong tool to advocate what they're doing, to communicate everything from new menu offerings and new, approaches of the restaurant, but also use it as an education tool to direct consumers to really credible information about things that consumers are concerned about, like organics, the origins of foods, what the restaurant is doing from a proactive standpoint to meet these demands. I think this is a great way to show how restaurants are being responsive to consumers' wishes and an opportunity to present the real good scientific facts and being transparent. And this includes, obviously, staying on top of what consumers are saying, engaging where appropriate, and then using this to strengthen their reputation and demonstrating that the restaurant is responsive to issues. So, again, taking this proactive approach. And then, if and when it's needed, using social media to issue warnings if needed. But I do think that if a company has kind of invested and done a lot of the proactive upfront to build up their reputation and demonstrate their responsiveness, such messages, like a warning, is much more likely to be followed and potentially be less damaging as well. So I really think we need to be ready to promote the good, take on the unpleasant, and then recover quickly. But it's certainly a balancing act, and the pervasive social media platform can make this easy to do and is increasingly a very, very crucial part of any kind of communication strategy.
Great. Thank you very much, Ruth. That's all very good information. We appreciate the time and expertise you shared with us today. As a reminder for those on the WebEx, please make sure to complete the survey that pops up as you exit the WebEx. That's where you'll check the box to get access to your continuing education certificate. So thank you very much for attending, and stay tuned for our next webinar in September.